In the dust-swept town of Cedar Creek, silence hangs as heavy as storm clouds. Sarah Mitchell's weathered hands arrange supplies in her small general store, her movements precise and measured, much like the way she once lined up targets through a rifle scope half a world away. The locals whisper about the quiet widow, but none know that behind those steady eyes lies the record for the longest confirmed kill in Marine Corps history. They don't know about the medal citations buried in her drawer, or the nickname that once made enemy commanders tremble, Ghost Eye. When 6 drunken outlaws ride into town, their laughter cutting through the afternoon quiet like broken glass, they see only what they want to see. A woman alone, vulnerable, easy prey. They don't notice how she tracks their movements without seeming to look, or how her fingers brush the counter's edge with the same deliberate calm she once used to squeeze a trigger. They have no idea that they're not the hunters here. They're the targets. And Sarah Mitchell is about to remind them why some ghosts from the past should never be disturbed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Morning light filtered through the dusty windows of Mitchell's general store, casting long shadows across shelves stocked with everything from dried beans to mining supplies. Sarah Mitchell moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, each motion deliberate and purposeful. Her fingers traced the spine of the leather-bound ledger as she reviewed yesterday's transactions, though her attention never truly left the street outside. The familiar weight of the derringer pressed against her ankle provided a comfort she'd never quite shaken, even after 5 years of civilian life. Old habits, ingrained through 3 tours of duty, died hard. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she remembered her drill instructor's words. Situational awareness isn't paranoia if they're really out to get you. Sheriff Tom Hayes's boots announced his arrival before he pushed through the front door, bringing with him the smell of trail dust and tobacco. He was one of only 2 people in Cedar Creek who knew her full story, and he'd kept her secret since the day she arrived. "Morning, Sarah," he said, removing his hat. "Thought you might want to know. Got word of some trouble heading our way. Gang of riders seen leaving Willow Creek yesterday, leaving behind a mess of broken furniture and 1 dead man." Sarah's hands stilled on the ledger. "Drunk or deliberate?" "Both, I expect." Tom leaned against the counter, his weathered face creased with concern. "Leader's a man called Marcus Reed. Name mean anything to you?" It did. Sarah's mind flashed to a military intelligence briefing from her final tour, a smuggling operation that had partnered with local insurgents, run by an American expatriate named Reed, the same man whose network had later supplied weapons to the raiders who'd killed James, her husband, 2 years after they'd settled here. "Might," she said carefully, maintaining the measured tone she'd cultivated since taking over the store. "How many?" 6 riders. Mean bunch. Been working their way through the territory, targeting smaller towns. They pick soft targets, usually businesses run by women or older folks. Rob them clean, sometimes worse. Sarah moved to adjust the merchandise in her front window, using the motion to scan the street. The town was quiet. Just Mrs. Henderson, leading her 2 children to the schoolhouse, and old Bill Cooper opening his barber shop. Normal morning routines masking the tension she could feel building. "I can send for help from the territorial marshal," Tom offered, though they both knew help would arrive too late if Reed's gang decided to make trouble. Sarah's fingers unconsciously traced the scar on her left forearm, a reminder of a night in Fallujah when, too late, had cost 3 good Marines. Their lives. She'd learned then that sometimes the only backup you could count on was the one you created yourself. "Town's got a sheriff," she replied evenly. "That's help enough." Tom's expression darkened. "Sarah, I know what you're capable of. Seen the medals, read the citations, but this isn't a military operation. These men are predators," she finished. "And predators get careless when they think they've found easy prey." She moved to the back room, unlocking a heavy trunk. and kept behind bolts of fabric. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay her old Model 1895 Marine Corps rifle. She hadn't fired it since James died, but she still maintained it with religious devotion. Every Saturday night after closing the store, she'd break it down, clean each part, and reassemble it. Movements so ingrained they felt like a meditation. "I'm not looking for trouble, Tom," she said, closing the trunk, "but I won't run from it either. Not again." The sheriff studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Just remember you're not alone here. Whatever you're planning, whatever happens, you've got friends." As Tom left, Sarah returned to her ledger, but her mind was already shifting into familiar patterns, analyzing sightlines, cataloging potential cover, identifying fallback positions. The store's upper floor had clear views of the main street. The roof of Cooper's barbershop could provide an elevated position with multiple escape routes. The narrow alley behind the store, she caught herself and took a deliberate breath. James had always said she thought too much like a soldier. "You're home now," he'd tell her, holding her through the nightmares. "The war's over." But as Sarah watched dust devils dance down Cedar Creek's main street, she couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps the war had finally found her. And this time, she wouldn't be the one caught unprepared. The midday sun beat down on Cedar Creek as Jimmy Carter swept the boardwalk in front of Mitchell's General Store, pausing occasionally to watch dusty travelers pass through town. At 16, he was tall for his age, but reed-thin, all elbows and nervous energy. Sarah had hired him 6 months ago, despite the townspeople's warnings about his family's reputation. She recognized something in the boy that others missed, a watchfulness, a quiet determination to prove himself. "Mrs. Mitchell," Jimmy called through the open door. "Riders coming in from the east, 6 of them." Sarah noted the slight tremor in his voice. She'd been teaching him to observe, to report details calmly, like she'd once taught young Marines to relay reconnaissance. "What else do you see, Jimmy?" "Well armed. Matching horses, probably stolen from the same place. Leaders wearing a black duster, got a silver-handled revolver." He squinted. "They're spreading out as they ride in, 2 hanging back, watching the alleys." "Good eye." Sarah moved to the counter, casually checking the shotgun hidden beneath. "Go get some water from the well. Take your time." Jimmy nodded, understanding her real message. "Get clear. Stay alert." As he disappeared around back, Sarah watched through the window as the riders dismounted outside the saloon. Their leader, Marcus Reed, was exactly as she remembered from the intelligence photos, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruel set of his mouth. The evening crowd at the saloon gave the newcomers a wide berth, conversations dying as Reed's men claimed the best tables. Sarah could hear their laughter through the walls, growing louder and more aggressive as the hours passed. She used the time to prepare, moving valuable merchandise to the back room, checking sight lines, mentally marking distances. After sunset, she climbed to the store's upper floor where she kept her private quarters. Behind a false panel in the wardrobe, her rifle collection remained pristine. The Marine Corps rifle, a Winchester repeater, and her pride, a custom Sharps buffalo gun capable of incredible accuracy at ranges that would make most marksmen scoff. She ran her fingers along the Sharps barrel, remembering the day James gave it to her. "For hunting," he'd said with a wink, knowing full well she'd spend more time maintaining it than hunting game. He'd understood her need for precision, for readiness, even as he helped her build a peaceful life. A commotion from the street drew her attention. 2 of Reed's men were harassing Mrs. Henderson as she closed up her dressmaking shop, their drunken voices carrying clearly in the evening air. "Mighty fine establishment you got here, ma'am," one slurred, blocking her path. "Shame if anything were to happen to it." Sarah's hand tightened on the rifle, but she forced herself to wait. Direct confrontation now would only escalate things faster than the town was ready for. Instead, she watched as Sheriff Hayes appeared, his hand resting casually on his holstered gun. "Evening, gentlemen," he said. his voice carrying the quiet. Authority that had kept Cedar Creek peaceful for 15 years. Might want to head back to the saloon. Ladies trying to close up. The outlaws traded looks, measuring the sheriff. After a tense moment, they backed off with exaggerated courtesy, but their eyes promised future trouble. Later that night, after the store was closed, Jimmy returned with news gleaned from his extensive network of teenage informants. "They've been asking questions, Mrs. Mitchell, about you specifically, about the store." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "What kind of questions? Whether you've got family nearby, how long you've been here?" Jimmy hesitated. "They asked if you ever get any military visitors." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. This wasn't just random harassment. They were gathering intelligence, probably had been for days before arriving. Reed was running the same kind of operation he'd used overseas, just adapted for the frontier. Identify targets, gather information, apply pressure, then strike when resistance seemed weakest. "Jimmy," she said carefully, "things might get difficult here soon. If you want to visit your aunt in Preston for a while." The boy straightened his spine. "My place is here, Mrs. Mitchell. You gave me a chance when nobody else would. Besides," he added with a hint of pride, "who else is going to watch the back alleys for you?" Sarah felt a familiar ache in her chest, the same one she'd felt watching young Marines volunteer for dangerous missions, their faith in her leadership both inspiring and terrifying. She'd lost too many good people by underestimating threats. She wouldn't make that mistake again. "All right," she said, "but we do this smart. I'm going to teach you some things I learned in the Marines. You follow my instructions exactly. Understood?" Jimmy nodded solemnly, and Sarah began outlining protocols for communication, observation posts, and emergency procedures. As she spoke, she could see Reed's men through the window, watching her store from the shadows of the saloon. Let them watch, she thought. Let them think they had the advantage. They'd learn soon enough that the quiet widow they were targeting had spent years teaching much more dangerous men the painful price of underestimation. The peace shattered 3 days after Reed's gang arrived in Cedar Creek. Sarah was inventorying her ammunition stock when she heard the crash from the front of the store, followed by Jimmy's startled yelp. She moved silently to the doorway, staying in the shadows as she assessed the situation. 3 of Reed's men had Jimmy cornered against the seed displays. Glass from a broken lantern crunched under their boots as they circled the boy. The largest, one, a brute with a scarred face, held Jimmy's worn ledger book. "Quite the bookkeeper you got here, Mrs. Mitchell," the man called out, knowing she was watching. "Boy's got real neat handwriting. Shame if something happened to his fingers." Sarah stepped into view, her movements measured, deliberate. Nothing in her stance betrayed the combat-ready tension in her muscles. "That ledger's store property," she said calmly. "So's the lantern you broke. I'll accept payment for both now." The outlaws laughed, but Sarah caught the subtle shift in their positioning, unconsciously moving to cover each other's blind spots. These weren't just drunken thugs. They had military training, or at least enough experience to have learned similar habits. "Mighty particular about your property, ain't you?" The scarred man, Sarah remembered Jimmy calling him Fletcher, moved closer. "Way I hear it, you're particular about a lot of things, like them fancy rifles you keep upstairs. Military grade, I'm told." Sarah's mind raced. They knew about her weapons, which meant they'd either been watching longer than she'd thought, or someone in town was feeding them information. Either way, the situation was deteriorating faster than expected. "I'm a business owner," she said. "I keep what I need to protect my interests." Fletcher's grin turned ugly. "Protect? Now that's funny. See, protection's exactly what we're here to discuss." He gestured around the store. "Nice place you got. Be a real shame if anything happened to it," Sarah finished, her voice taking on an edge that made Jimmy's eyes widen. "That's the second time your friends have used that threat in 3 days. Might want to try something more original." The temperature in the room seemed to drop as Fletcher's amusement vanished. He shoved Jimmy aside and stalked towards Sarah, looming over her. She didn't back away. recognizing the intimidation technique, create close contact, force submission through physical presence. She'd seen it used in a dozen war zones. You think you're clever, don't you? Fletcher's breath reeked of cheap whiskey. Think because you run this little shop and have the sheriff's ear, you're untouchable? He leaned closer. Let me tell you how this works. You're going to start paying us a monthly fee for protection. You'll store whatever goods we tell you to store, no questions asked, and you'll do it with a smile or what? Sarah's voice could have frozen hell itself. You'll hurt the boy? Burn the store? Kill me like your boss had my husband killed? Fletcher blinked, surprised. Behind him, his companions exchanged uncertain looks. Oh yes, Sarah continued, her calm facade cracking to reveal something that made Fletcher step back. I know exactly who Marcus Reed is. I know about his weapons running in Fallujah. I know about the raids his merchandise enabled. And I know he's graduated to terrorizing frontier towns because he's too cowardly to operate anywhere with real law enforcement. Fletcher's hand dropped to his gun, but Sarah was already moving. Years of training took over as she drove her palm up into his nose, following through with an elbow strike to his throat. He staggered back, choking, as his companions reached. For their weapons, I wouldn't, Sarah said, the shotgun seemingly materializing in her hands from beneath the counter. Your friend there's going to need medical attention. Crushed larynx can kill a man, if not treated properly. The outlaws froze, caught between their wounded companion and the deadly certainty in Sarah's eyes. After a tense moment, they grabbed Fletcher and backed toward the door. This ain't over, one spat. No, Sarah agreed. It isn't. Tell Reed something for me. Her voice took on the cold precision she'd used giving orders in combat. Tell him I remember his face from the intelligence briefings. Tell him I know what he did to those villagers. And tell him that if he wants to add another widow to his list of victims, he'd better bring more men than this. After they fled, Jimmy emerged from behind the counter where he'd taken cover. Mrs. Mitchell, what do we do now? Sarah watched. Through the window as the outlaws carried Fletcher to the doctor's office, Reed stood in front of the saloon, his expression thunderous as his men reported their failure. She'd just changed the game, revealing her knowledge of his past. Now he couldn't afford to let her live, regardless of what she did next. Now, Jimmy, she said, checking the shotgun's loads with practiced efficiency, we prepare for war. Sarah spent the night mapping Cedar Creek in her mind, the same way she'd once memorized combat zones. Every rooftop, every alley, every possible line of fire, all carefully catalogued and evaluated. The town's layout wasn't ideal for defense, but it had advantages she could exploit. She worked by lamplight in the store's back room, sketching crude diagrams on brown paper. Jimmy watched intently as she marked key positions, his young face serious in the flickering light. The saloon gives them the high ground, she explained, marking it with an X, but it also pins them down to one location. They'll want to establish a secondary position, probably the abandoned mill. Her pencil moved to the structure at the town's edge. It's the only other building tall enough to counter our positions. Our positions? Jimmy asked. Sarah nodded toward her rough map. Cooper's barbershop roof, the church bell tower, and the store's upper floor. 3 points of cover, multiple escape routes. She paused, studying the boy's face. It's not too late to leave town, Jimmy. You know I won't. His voice carried a determination that reminded her of young recruits before their first combat mission, scared but resolute. A knock at the back door interrupted them. Sarah had the shotgun ready before Sheriff Hayes's voice called out the signal they'd arranged. 2 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Got word from Willow Creek, Tom said as he entered, his face grim. Reed's got more men coming, at least a dozen riders spotted heading this way. Sarah absorbed this without visible reaction, though her mind was already recalculating odds and adjusting plans. How long? 2 days. Maybe 3 if the weather turns. Tom studied her map. Sarah, I've sent for the territorial marshal, but they won't get here in time, she finished. I know. Most folks are leaving town. Henderson family's already gone. Cooper's loading his wagon now. Sarah nodded. She'd expected this. Civilian evacuation had always been part of her calculation. Fewer innocents meant fewer potential hostages, fewer complications. "What about you, Tom?" she asked quietly. "Your badge doesn't require you to die for this fight." The sheriff's weathered face hardened. "My badge requires me to protect this town, even if the town's down to one store and one stubborn widow." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. One store, one widow, one sheriff, and one brave boy. Not exactly the elite unit she'd once commanded, but they had something Reed's men didn't: the absolute certainty of their purpose. "Then let's get to work," she said, turning back to the map. "We've got 2 days to turn Cedar Creek into a trap they'll never forget." As dawn broke over the town, Sarah watched from her window as the last wagons of evacuating families rolled out. The street felt empty, abandoned, exactly what Reed would expect to find when his reinforcements arrived. He wouldn't realize that every vacant building, every shadowed doorway, and every quiet alley was about to become part of an elaborate kill zone, designed by someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of turning urban terrain into a weapon. War had taught her that victory often belonged not to the side with more guns, but to the side that better understood the battlefield. Cedar Creek was about to become her battlefield, and Sarah Mitchell intended to make every inch of it count. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Cedar Creek's main street when Reed made his first mistake. His men had spent the morning getting increasingly drunk and bold, firing random shots at weather vanes and harassing the few townspeople who remained. Sarah watched it all from her store's upper window, waiting for the moment she knew would come. It arrived just past 3 o'clock. Fletcher, his throat still bruised from their earlier encounter, stumbled out of the saloon with 2 others. They carried torches despite the daylight, a clear message about their intentions. "Come on out, Mrs. Mitchell." Fletcher's voice was still raspy. "Time to discuss our business arrangement." Sarah had already moved to the roof, her sharps rifle resting on a specially prepared sandbag. Through the scope, she could see every detail of Fletcher's face, count every whisker. The distance was barely worth measuring for someone who'd made confirmed kills at over 1,000 yards. "Think she ran off with the others?" one of Fletcher's companions asked, swaying slightly. "Nah, she's watching." Fletcher spat on the ground. "Ain't that right, widow? Watching and scared?" Sarah's finger curled around the trigger. The wind was negligible, the air clear. It would be so easy to end Fletcher right there. But that wasn't the play. Not yet. "Last chance." Fletcher shouted, moving toward the store with his torch. "Come out, or we start redecorating." Sarah exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The sharps roared. Fletcher's torch exploded into splinters, the bullet passing so close to his hand. It left a burn from the air displacement alone. Before the echo of the first shot faded, she worked the action and fired again. The second torch detonated. The third shot knocked the last torch into the dirt. 3 shots, 3 targets, less than 2 seconds. The street erupted into chaos. Fletcher and his men dove for cover, their drunken bravado replaced by genuine terror. From the saloon doorway, Reed watched with narrow eyes, finally seeing the true scope of his miscalculation. "That's your only warning." Sarah's voice carried clearly in the sudden silence. "Next time, I don't aim for the torches." Jimmy, watching from his hidden position behind the water trough, saw Reed's face darken with rage. But there was something else there, too: recognition. Reed now understood exactly who he was dealing with. "Clear the street," Reed ordered his men. "Everyone inside, now!" As the outlaws scrambled for cover, Sarah maintained her position, scanning methodically through her scope. Through the saloon's windows, she could see Reed gathering his men, gesturing angrily. They'd be more cautious now, more strategic in their approach. Sheriff Hayes appeared below, casually walking the street as if nothing had happened. He paused to grind out one of the smoldering torches with his boot. "That's some mighty fine shooting, Mrs. Mitchell," he called out, not looking up. "Though I'd appreciate a warning next time you plan to liven up my afternoon." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The sheriff's casual demeanor would tell Reed something important. The law in Cedar Creek stood with her. Any hope Reed had of playing this off as legitimate business enforcement had just evaporated. Later, as dusk approached, Jimmy brought news from his reconnaissance. "They're moving supplies into the mill, just like you said they would. And Mr. Reed, he sent 2 riders out, fast ones. Going to get their reinforcements," Sarah nodded. "Good. That means they'll wait before trying anything else. Gives us time to finish our preparations." "They looked scared, Mrs. Mitchell, after the shooting." "Fear's good," Sarah said, cleaning her rifle with practiced motions. "Fear makes men cautious. Cautious men make mistakes, and out here mistakes get you killed." She checked her ammunition supply, mind already turning to the next phase of her plan. The warning shot had served its purpose, demonstrated her capabilities, established dominance, and forced Reed to reveal his backup strategy with the mill. Now the real work could begin. Reed's reinforcements arrived before dawn on the 3rd day. Sarah counted 12 riders through her scope as they filtered into town, moving with the kind of precision that confirmed her worst fears. These weren't just hired guns, but trained fighters, former soldiers probably, who'd turned their skills to darker purposes after the war. "They're carrying military-grade weapons," she told Sheriff Hayes as they watched from the church bell tower. "Springfield rifles, newer models, not the kind of hardware common outlaws get their hands on." Tom's expression was grim. "Looks like your intelligence about Reed's weapon running was accurate." "He's not just running guns anymore," Sarah said quietly. "He's building an army." The morning brought the first real violence. One of the few remaining townspeople, old Bill Cooper, was caught trying to sneak back into his barber shop for his grandfather's straight razor. Reed's men caught him in the alley. The sound of the beating carried through the quiet streets. Sarah's finger tightened on her rifle's trigger, but Hayes caught her arm. "Too many angles," he warned. "They're baiting us." He was right. Through her scope, she could see at least 4 riflemen covering the alley from different positions. They were learning, adapting to her tactics. Any attempt to help Cooper would trigger a crossfire. Jimmy appeared at the back entrance of the store an hour later, his face pale. "They've got Mr. Cooper in the saloon. He swallowed hard. "They're making an example of him." Sarah felt ice form in her gut. This was her fault. She'd shown her hand too early with the warning shots, forced Reed to escalate. Now innocent people were paying the price. "Tom," she said, her voice carrying the command tone she hadn't used since. "The war. Get to your office. Make it obvious. Draw their attention." The sheriff nodded, understanding. He made a show of walking down the street, badge glinting in the morning sun. As predicted, several of Reed's men moved to cover him, repositioning their fields of fire. Sarah used their distraction to ghost through back alleys to the rear of the saloon. Years of combat experience guided her movements as she slipped through blind spots in their coverage. She could hear Cooper's pained breathing through the back window, along with Reed's voice. This is what happens to people who side with her. But it doesn't have to go this way. Tell us what you know about the widow's operation, and this ends. Sarah's hand tightened on her combat knife. Close-quarters combat wasn't her specialty. She was a sniper, trained to end fights before they began. But sometimes silence and steel were the only options. The back door's hinges had been oiled. Jimmy's work, she realized with pride. 2 men. Inside, both focused on Cooper. The first never saw her come through the door. The second managed half a turn before her knife found his throat. Cooper stared at her with his one good eye, the other swollen shut. "Mrs. Mitchell." "Quiet," she whispered, cutting his bonds. "Service entrance. 3 steps. Jimmy's waiting." She covered their retreat, every nerve screaming at the exposure. But Reed's men were still watching the street, waiting for a shot that would never come. By the time they found their dead companions, Cooper was safely hidden in the church basement, with Jimmy tending his wounds. Sarah made it back to her position, just as Reed stormed out of the saloon, rage twisting his features as he shouted orders. She allowed herself a grim smile. Let him rage. Let him realize that for every hostage he took, for every innocent he hurt, she would extract a price in blood. But her victory was short-lived. As dusk approached, Jimmy reported more riders approaching from the east. Not more reinforcements, these were different. Townsfolk. Reed's men had found the evacuation column and were herding them back to Cedar Creek at gunpoint. The game was changing again. Now Sarah had to protect not just her store, not just her town, but every man, woman and child being forced back into the killing field Cedar Creek had become. She looked down at her hands, steady as ever on her rifle, and made a silent promise. To them all, Reed thought hostages would force her to stand down. Instead, they would only ensure that when she finally put a bullet through his head, it would be with absolute righteous certainty. Reed's men herded the captured townspeople into the church, posting guards at every entrance. Sarah watched through her scope as families huddled together in the growing darkness, children crying, parents trying to maintain brave faces. Her enhanced optics, carefully preserved from her military days, revealed every detail of their fear. "Recognize anyone in that new bunch?" Sheriff Hayes asked quietly, referring to Reed's latest reinforcements. "2 former military," Sarah replied, still scanning. "The way they move, how they position themselves. They've had combat training. The others are just hired guns." She paused, focusing on a new figure emerging from the saloon. "Wait, that one's different." The man wore an expensive suit despite the frontier setting, his manner more businessman than bandit. He spoke briefly with Reed, passing him what looked like official papers. "That's Lawrence Bishop," Hayes spat the name. "Works for the Western Railways Corporation. Been trying to buy up land all through the territory." Sarah's mind raced pieces, clicking into place. The raids on the other towns, they weren't random. They were targeting places that refused to sell. And your store sits right where they want to build their new station. It made sense now. Reed's particular interest in her property, the escalation of violence, the professional soldiers. This wasn't just about revenge or criminal territory. They were corporate mercenaries, clearing the path for the railroad through. Fear and blood, a commotion from the church drew their attention. Reed's men were pulling people out one by one, questioning them about Sarah's movements, her habits, her weaknesses. Most claimed ignorance, and Sarah felt a surge of pride in her. Neighbors' loyalty, but she knew Reed would eventually find someone who'd break under pressure. "Mrs. Mitchell!" Jimmy's urgent whisper came from the shadow of a water barrel. "They've got the Henderson kids separated from their parents, in the mill." Sarah's jaw tightened. Using children as leverage, it was exactly the kind of tactic she'd seen Reed employ overseas. Break the parents by threatening the children. Break the children by making them watch their parents suffer. "How many guards?" she asked. "4 outside, at least 2 in. But there's something else." Jimmy hesitated. "I overheard them talking. Bishop's got papers, legal documents, says the town council approved the railroad's claim 3 months ago." "That's impossible," Hayes interrupted. "Council never voted on any—" He stopped, realization dawning. "Unless Jenkins, the clerk?" Sarah asked. Hayes nodded grimly. "Has access to all the official documents, all the seals. Could have forged approval papers, backdated them. Which means this is bigger than Reed," Sarah concluded. "They've got people inside the territorial government, probably all the way up to the capital." She'd seen similar corruption during the war. Legitimate businesses using criminal muscle to clear obstacles, all covered by a thin veneer of legal authority. A child's cry echoed from the mill, quickly muffled. Sarah's decision was instant. "Jimmy, get back to Cooper. Tell him to be ready with that medical kit." She turned to Hayes. "Tom, I need you to make a very public show of heading to your office. Draw their attention east." "What are you thinking?" Sarah checked her ammunition. "Reed expects me to keep my distance, use the rifle. Time to remind him that snipers train for close work too." She stripped off her long coat, revealing the combat webbing underneath. Dark clothes, multiple knives, ammunition, pouches. She'd been wearing her battle gear under civilian clothes since the first day Reed arrived. "Sarah," Hayes looked at her with concern, "you start this, there's no going back. Even if you win, they'll paint you as the aggressor. Bishop's got the papers to make it all look legal." "Legal doesn't mean right," Sarah's voice carried the cold certainty of someone who'd made peace with violence long ago. And those children have been listening to their parents' screams for 10 minutes now. We're past caring about legal. She checked her weapons one final time. Rifle slung for mobility, pistol holstered at her hip, knives positioned for quick draws. Years of muscle memory took over as she mentally mapped her approach route. Besides, she added with grim satisfaction, dead men have a hard time testifying about legal documents. As she melted into the shadows, Sarah felt the familiar calm of combat settling over her. Reed thought he could use her neighbors against her, break her with their pain. Instead, he'd just given her something far more dangerous than any weapon, a righteous cause. The ghost was going hunting. Before Sarah could mount her rescue of the Henderson children, fate forced her hand. The crackle of flames drew her attention to her store. Reed's men had finally decided to make good on their threats. Fire licked up the side of the building, spreading quickly across the dry wood. Jimmy emerged from his observation post, panic in his eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell, the strongbox, all your papers!" But Sarah was already moving, not toward the flames, but to a hidden cellar entrance behind the store. "Third floorboard from the wall," she called to Jimmy. "Pull it up. Get the metal case underneath. Don't stop for anything else." While the boy darted to follow her orders, Sarah sprinted through the shadows. Reed's men were so focused on the growing blaze, they never saw her coming. Two went down silently, her knife finding the soft spots in their necks that her Marine combat instructors had drilled into her muscle memory. She reached the cellar just as Jimmy emerged, struggling with a heavy metal case. Inside was something far more valuable than store receipts or deed papers. Her complete military documentation, combat records, and most importantly, a list of contacts she'd hoped never to need again. "Get to the church basement," she ordered Jimmy. "Stay with Cooper." But the boy hesitated. "What about the Henderson kids?" "First, we even the odds." Sarah moved to the back of the cellar, counting stones until she found the right one. Behind it was a sealed tube containing a telegram she'd written years ago but never sent. Now she handed it to Jimmy with a handful of coins. "Telegraph office in Preston. Operator's name is Marcus. Give him this exact message, no changes. Tell him it's from Ghost Eye. He'll know what to do." As Jimmy disappeared into the night, Sarah turned her attention back to the burning store. The flames cast wild shadows across the street, creating a nightmare tableau of Reed's men celebrating their victory. They thought they'd struck a decisive blow, destroying her livelihood and home. She allowed herself a cold smile. They had no idea they'd just freed her to act without restraint. The hours until dawn passed in a blur of precise violence. Sarah moved through the town like the ghost she'd once been named for, eliminating isolated sentries, sabotaging weapons, creating confusion in the enemy ranks. By the time the sun rose, 6 of Reed's men had vanished without a trace, and the rest were jumping at shadows. She was checking her ammunition when Jimmy returned, breathless but triumphant. "Message sent," Marcus said. The boy paused, confused. He said, "The old unit rides at dawn." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. That simple phrase meant more than Reed could possibly imagine. Her former unit, hardened Marine scouts and snipers who'd followed her through the war's bloodiest campaigns, would soon be riding for Cedar Creek. Men and women who owed her their lives, who'd never forgotten their commander, and who'd drop everything to answer her call, but they were still at least 2 days away. The Henderson children couldn't wait that long. "One more thing," Jimmy added. "I saw something at the mill. They've got crates in there, lots of them. Military stamps like you described." "Weapons shipment," Sarah nodded. Of course, Reed wasn't. Just using the railroad plan as cover. He was setting up a distribution hub for his illegal arms trade, using corporate paperwork to hide military-grade weapons in legitimate cargo shipments. A child's muffled sob from the mill crystallized her decision. The weapons meant Reed's operation was bigger than she'd thought, but it also meant she had a chance to hurt him permanently. Save the children, destroy his merchandise, and bloody his forces enough to delay any retaliation until her old unit arrived. Sarah began her final preparations, checking weapons with practiced efficiency. Jimmy watched with wide eyes as she transformed, civilian clothes replaced by full combat gear. Every knife, every spare magazine, every piece of equipment positioned exactly where muscle memory would find it in the dark. "Remember," she told Jimmy, "if anything happens to me, Cooper knows where I kept the evidence about Reed's operation. Get it to the territorial marshal." The boy straightened his spine. "Nothing's going to happen to you, Mrs. Mitchell. You're Ghost Eye." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The name didn't feel like a burden anymore. Ghost Eye had been a legend, a shadow that struck fear into enemy commanders. Tonight, Reed would learn why. Sarah spent the pre-dawn hours converting Cedar Creek into a combat zone. Her store might be gone, but she'd prepared for this possibility, establishing supply caches throughout the town in the days since Reed's arrival. Now, she moved methodically, from location to location, arming her improvised defensive positions. Cooper, his face still bruised but his hands steady, helped her distribute ammunition among the designated points. "Never thought I'd be glad my pa insisted I learn shooting during the war," he said quietly as they worked. "You remember the signals we discussed?" Sarah asked, checking sightlines from behind a stack of crates. 3 shots for trouble, 2 for all clear, 1 if we spot their reinforcements." Cooper nodded toward the church. "But what about the townsfolk? Reed's got them all locked up tight." "That's why we're doing this carefully." Sarah removed a small package from one of her caches, military-grade smoke grenades preserved from her service days. "We create chaos, use it as cover. The children first, then the other hostages." Sheriff Hayes joined them, moving carefully through the shadows. "Bishop's getting nervous," he reported. "Been sending telegrams every hour. Whatever he's planning, he needs it done fast." "Corporate deadline," Sarah surmised. "The railroad needs this land secured before the Territorial Commission meets next week. That's why they're rushing, making mistakes." She gathered the small group of trusted townspeople who'd managed to avoid capture, mostly veterans like Cooper, who'd recognized the signs of coming violence and hidden in time. In the basement of the church, using Jimmy's charcoal sketches of the town layout, she began outlining her strategy. "Reed's men are professionals, but they're overconfident. They think they've got us outnumbered and outgunned." She pointed to key positions on the map. "We're going to let them keep thinking that while we position ourselves here, here, and here, when my old unit arrives, they'll hit from the east while we create disruption from within." "What about the children?" Mrs. Cooper asked, her voice tight with worry. "They're my first priority," Sarah assured her. "Tonight, while the main force is distracted, I'm going in alone to get them out. Once they're safe, we can be more aggressive in our tactics." She distributed weapons and assignments, carefully matching each person's skills to their role. Former cavalry soldiers would handle the mounted response when her unit arrived. Infantry veterans took sniper positions, even those without military experience were given vital tasks, managing supplies, preparing medical stations, maintaining communication lines. Jimmy appeared at her elbow as she finished the briefing. "Riders approaching from the south," he reported. "Not military. Looks like more of Bishop's men, suits and papers." Sarah's expression hardened. The corporate side of this operation was escalating too. They're trying to establish legitimate presence before the commission arrives. Make it look like a legal business dispute instead of armed occupation. "Sarah," Hayes said quietly, "if they get official territorial representatives here, seeing you armed and opposing them—" "I know." She checked her weapons with practiced efficiency. "That's why we need to end this before they can build their paper fortress. Tonight we free the children. Tomorrow we show Reed and his corporate masters that some things can't be bought or bullied." She moved to the church's small window, watching Reed's men patrol the streets they thought they controlled. They were tough, well-armed, and experienced. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They thought they were fighting a widow running a store, not a Marine commander who'd spent years teaching other professionals how to kill. "Get some rest," she told her makeshift militia. "Tonight we remind them why they used to call me Ghost Eye, and tomorrow—" She chambered around in her rifle, the sound sharp and final in the quiet basement. "Tomorrow we take back our town." The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness as Sarah's people moved into position, using the network of cellars and hidden paths she'd mapped out. Every hour brought more of Bishop's corporate men, carrying papers and proclamations, trying to paint a veneer of legitimacy over Reed's brutality. Let them come, Sarah thought. Let them bring their documents and declarations. By the time her old unit arrived, she'd give them something no amount of paperwork could cover up: the truth about Reed's operation, written in brass shell casings and spilled blood. The plan was set to begin at midnight. Sarah had every detail memorized: the guard rotations, the escape routes, the fallback positions. What she hadn't counted on was human nature and the devastating power of fear. She was checking her equipment one final time when Sheriff Hayes burst into the church basement, his face ashen. "Sarah," Jenkins talked, told them everything. Her blood ran cold. Jenkins, the town clerk, had been one of the few who knew all the details of her preparation. He'd helped map the tunnel network beneath the town, documented the supply caches, even assisted in coordinating with their hidden allies. "How bad?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Complete." Hayes ran a hand through his gray hair. "Reed's men are hitting the storage points now. They know about the tunnels, the signals, the evacuation plans, and—" He hesitated. "They've got Jimmy." The world seemed to stop. Sarah's hands stilled on her rifle, her mind racing through implications, calculating odds, formulating new strategies. But beneath the tactical analysis, a cold fury was building. "Jenkins broke under questioning?" she asked, her voice deadly calm. Hayes shook his head. "No questioning needed. He walked into the saloon an hour ago, asked for Reed by name. Turns out he's been working for the railroad all along. Those forged documents weren't forged at all. He's been their man for months." Sarah moved to the window. Already she could see Reed's men taking up new positions, covering the approaches she'd carefully planned. Everything she'd prepared was being systematically dismantled. "Where are they holding Jimmy?" "Mill's upper floor. Reed's using him as bait. Knows you'll—" Hayes stopped as Sarah checked her ammunition with mechanical precision. "Sarah, you can't. That's what they want." "I know exactly what they want." Her voice carried the cold certainty that had made hardened Marines follow her into battle. "They want me to come in angry, make mistakes, fight on their terms. And I'm going to give them exactly what they expect, because that's what Jenkins told them to expect. The grieving widow, the protective guardian, the emotional woman who'll rush in without thinking." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Jenkins never knew me during the war, never saw what I'm really capable of." She moved to the basement's hidden gun rack, retrieving not her usual rifle, but a shorter carbine better suited for close work. Additional magazines went into her combat webbing, each one meticulously maintained and loaded with hand-selected ammunition. "Sarah," Hayes tried one more time, "they know all our plans." "No." She checked her knives, ensuring each one moved smoothly in its sheath. "They know the plans I let Jenkins see, the ones I discussed openly. Did you really think I survived 3 tours by not having contingencies?" Understanding dawned in Hayes's eyes. "You suspected him. I've suspected everyone. War teaches you that." Sarah moved to a corner of the basement, pushing aside a stack of crates to reveal a hidden trap door. "This tunnel isn't on any of the maps Jenkins saw. Leads straight to the cooper's shop, 40 yards from the mill. And the weapons caches they're hitting. Decoys, enough ammunition to make them feel successful, not enough to make a difference." She checked her pocket watch. "Reed's men will be spread thin, hitting multiple locations, expecting me to either surrender myself for Jimmy or attempt a desperate rescue." She smiled, and there was nothing of the widow shopkeeper in it. They won't be expecting what's about to hit them. The next hour unfolded like a deadly chess game. Reed's men, armed with Jenkins' intelligence, moved with confidence to secure what they thought were Sarah's crucial positions. They found enough resistance to convince them they were winning. Cooper and a few other veterans putting up just enough of a fight to seem desperate. But Sarah was already moving through her true network of passages, some dating back to the town's earliest days. Others she'd quietly prepared during peaceful times. As she emerged in the Cooper's shop, she could hear Reed's voice from the mill, taunting her through the night air. "I know you can hear me, Ghost Eye." His voice carried genuine anger now, the frustration of a man who thought he'd finally won, only to feel victory slipping away. "Your plans are exposed. Your little network is finished. Surrender now and maybe the boy lives." Sarah's response was precisely targeted shots that shattered every lamp around the mill, plunging the area into darkness. In the confusion, more shots rang out from multiple directions. The handful of townspeople she'd truly trusted, firing from positions even Jenkins didn't know about. Reed's men returned fire at the apparent threats, exactly as Sarah had planned. In their focus on the diversionary attacks, they never saw her scale the mill's back wall, never heard her slip through the window Jenkins had assured them was too small for entry. She found Jimmy tied to a chair, Fletcher standing guard with the revolver pressed to the boy's head. The former soldier turned outlaw was professional enough to be watching the door, expecting her to come through it. She came through the ceiling instead. The fight was brief and silent. Fletcher managed half a turn before Sarah's garrote ended. Any chance of him raising an alarm? As she cut Jimmy's bonds, the boy's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "You came for me," he whispered. "Always," she replied, checking him for injuries. "Can you walk?" Before he could answer, slow clapping echoed through the room. Reed emerged from the shadows, Bishop at his side, both men holding revolvers. "Magnificent," Reed said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Jenkins told us you were good, but this is art. How long have you been playing us?" "Since the day you rode into town." Sarah kept herself between the guns and Jimmy. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize you? That I wouldn't prepare?" "Prepare." "Yes." Reed gestured. "And more." Of his men appeared at the windows, rifles aimed. "But for what? You're surrounded, your supplies captured, your allies scattered, and now, thanks to Jenkins, we have proof that you're a dangerous insurgent threatening legitimate business interests. When the Territorial Commission arrives tomorrow, they'll find a peaceful corporate operation that was forced to defend itself against a militant holdout." He stepped closer, enjoying his moment of triumph. "Face it, Ghost Eye, you've lost. The railroad gets its land, I get my distribution hub, and you get to watch everything you fought to protect torn down and rebuilt in our image." Sarah smiled then, and something in her expression made Reed take a step back. "Jenkins really didn't know me at all," she said softly. "If he did, he'd have told you the most important lesson I learned in the war." Her eyes met Reed's. "A good sniper never takes the shot until all the pieces are exactly where they need to be." The distant sound of hooves thundered through the night. Reed's head snapped toward the noise, and in that moment of distraction, Sarah moved. Her hidden derringer cleared its sleeve holster as Jimmy dove for cover just as she'd trained him. Two shots cracked in rapid succession. Reed and Bishop fell, their own shots going wild. Sarah's apparent surrender had drawn them in close, made them careless, made them forget that a Marine sniper was just as deadly at 2 paces as 200. Through the windows, she could see torch-carrying riders approaching fast. Not Reed's reinforcements, her old unit arriving exactly on schedule. Every move since Jenkins' betrayal had been calculated to pin Reed's forces in place, keeping them focused on her until real help could arrive. She turned to Jimmy, who was staring at her with newfound understanding. "Still trust me?" The boy nodded without hesitation. "Always." "Good, because the real fight's about to begin." The arrival of Sarah's old unit transformed the battlefield. 20 hardened veterans, each one a specialist in asymmetric warfare, moved through the darkness with practiced efficiency. At their head rode Captain Marcus Chen, his face scarred. From the same battle where he'd earned his loyalty to Ghost Eye. "Secure the perimeter," Sarah ordered as Chen dismounted. "Reed's dead, but his men still hold the church. Civilians inside." Chen nodded, already reading the tactical situation. "Jenkins, traitor, probably trying to reach the telegraph office. Williams Garcia," Chen barked to two riders. "Find him." Sarah led Jimmy to the relative safety of her unit's position, then turned her full attention to the battle ahead. Reed's remaining forces had barricaded themselves in the church, using the hostages as shields. They still had superior numbers, but they'd lost their leadership and their initiative. "They'll be expecting a frontal assault," she told her assembled veterans. "Standard rescue approach. Instead, we're going to show them why they called us ghosts." The plan unfolded with mechanical precision. Small teams moved through the tunnels Jenkins hadn't known about, emerging at crucial points around the church. Others took sniper positions, their scopes catching any glint of movement in the windows, but the real work was happening beneath the enemy's feet. "Modified breach protocol," Sarah explained, as she led a select team through the church's ancient foundation. "Same thing we used in Fallujah, but with a twist. They placed charges at key structural points, not to bring down the building, but to create precise, targeted chaos. When they detonated, the explosions would be small but strategic, designed to confuse and disorient rather than destroy. Above them, they could hear Reed's men arguing. Without their leader, their disciplined facade was cracking. Some wanted to surrender, others to fight to the death. The corporate mercenaries and common outlaws were turning on each other, exactly as Sarah had predicted. "Times like this, I almost—" "Miss War," Chen said quietly as they worked. "At least there you knew who the enemy was." Sarah checked her detonator wiring. "Enemies the same as always, Marcus. Men who think power gives them the right to destroy lives." She thought of Jenkins, of his betrayal born of greed and cowardice. In a way, he'd done her a favor. His treachery had drawn Reed and Bishop into the open, made them think they'd won, made them sloppy. The charges were set. Sarah gathered her team, each person knowing their role without need for discussion. Years of working together had forged them into something beyond a unit. They were a single organism, moving with shared purpose. "On my mark," she whispered into the darkness. "Remember, confusion and fear are our allies. Make them think they're surrounded by an army." The signal was given. The night erupted into carefully orchestrated chaos. The charges detonated in sequence, creating a wave of panic above. Simultaneously, Sarah's unit struck from multiple directions. Rifles cracked from hidden positions. Shadows moved at the edge of vision. Voices called out in the darkness, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. To Reed's men, it must have seemed like the whole town had come alive with vengeful ghosts. The first outlaws broke within minutes, throwing down their weapons and running. Others followed, their nerves shattered by the psychological assault. The professionals held out longer, but even they couldn't fight an enemy they couldn't see or count. By the time Sarah led the final breach into the church, most of the resistance had crumbled. The few remaining gunmen surrendered when they saw her step from the smoke, rifle raised, her unit's dark figures materializing behind her like avenging spirits. The hostages were shaken but unharmed. As her people led them to safety, Sarah turned to the captured mercenaries. In their eyes, she saw the dawning realization of who and what they'd been fighting. "The corporate masters you served," she said coldly. "They'll disavow you now." "No. Rescue, no legal help. You chose the wrong side of history." One of them, a former soldier by his bearing, spoke up. "We were just following orders." "So was I once." Sarah's voice carried the weight of hard lessons learned. "Then I learned there. Are orders worth refusing?" With the church secured and hostages safe, Sarah turned her attention to the remaining pockets of resistance. Reed's men had split into 3 groups, some holed up in the saloon, others fortifying the mill, and a few making a desperate stand. At the railroad company's temporary office. They're expecting us to pick them off one by one, Sarah told her assembled unit. So let's show them how Marines handle a three-target scenario. Chen's scarred face broke into a grim smile. Just like Baghdad. Just like Baghdad. They split into strike teams, each one led by a veteran of their past operations. Sarah took point on the mill assault. The building housed not just enemy combatants, but evidence of Reed's weapons trafficking operation. That evidence needed to be secured before anyone could destroy it. Jimmy insisted on joining her team despite her protests. I know every creaky board in that mill, he argued. Been playing there since I was little. Sarah recognized the look in his eyes, the same one she'd seen in young Marines, eager to prove themselves. Fine, but you stay with Garcia. You're our navigator, not our fighter. The assault began with a series of precisely timed explosions, not at their targets, but at carefully selected points around them. The blasts served multiple purposes, disrupting enemy communications, creating confusion about their true objectives, and most importantly, masking the sound of their approach. Sarah's team moved through the mill's blind spots, using routes Jimmy identified. The boy's knowledge proved invaluable. He knew exactly which stairs would give them away with squeaks and which walls were thin enough to hear through. They encountered the first resistance on the second floor. 3 of Reed's men had set up a defensive position, expecting an attack from the main stairwell. Instead, Sarah's team came through the grain chute Jimmy had used for childhood adventures. The fight was brief and decisive. Sarah's unit moved with the coordinated precision of long practice, each person covering angles and executing their role without need for verbal communication. Within seconds, the defenders were disarmed and secured. Found the weapons cache, Garcia reported over their signal system. Military-grade rifles, explosives, even some artillery pieces, enough to arm a small army or start a private war. Sarah replied grimly. Document everything. The territorial marshal will want gunfire from outside, interrupted her. One of Reed's men had managed to slip away, running toward the saloon. Sarah tracked him through her scope, but held her fire. His panic would serve their purposes better than his death. She was right. The fleeing man's terrified warning sparked a chaos in the saloon. Reed's remaining forces, realizing they were facing not just a widow with a rifle, but a coordinated military operation, began to turn on each other. Ghost Eye, Chen's voice came through their signal network. We've got movement. At the railroad office. They're burning documents. Let them, Sarah replied. We already have what we need. She patted the evidence Jimmy had helped her recover days ago, papers linking Reed's operation to corrupt railroad officials all the way up to the territorial capital. The saloon fell next, its defenders surrendering after a brief but intense exchange of fire. Sarah's unit had them surrounded, every escape route covered, every attempt at resistance met with overwhelming precision. By dawn, only the railroad office remained. Sarah approached it openly, her rifle slung casually over her shoulder. Behind her, the first rays of sunlight silhouetted her unit's positions on every rooftop and vantage point. You have 2 choices, she called out to the building's occupants. Surrender and testify about the railroad's corruption, or try to shoot your way out through 24 Marine Corps veterans who very much miss the simplicity of combat. There was a long pause, then the sound of weapons being unloaded. The door opened, and Bishop's remaining bureaucrats emerged with their hands raised, carrying boxes of documents they hadn't managed to destroy. Wise choice, Sarah said, as her people secured the suspects. I'd hate to put more holes in my town than necessary. Victory brought no celebration, only the methodical process of securing prisoners and evidence. Sarah watched her unit work, feeling a complex mix of emotions. These were the people she'd trusted with her life in combat, the ones who'd dropped everything to answer her call for help. And now, like ghosts, they'd fade back into civilian life until the next time duty called. What happens now? Jimmy asked. Still sticking close to Garcia as ordered, Sarah looked at the rising sun, thinking of all the rebuilding ahead. Now comes the hard part, kid. Peace. Victory seemed within reach, but Sarah knew better than to celebrate too early. Her years of combat experience had taught her that a cornered enemy was often the most dangerous. The proof of that lesson arrived with the thundering of hooves from the north. "Riders coming in," Jimmy called from his lookout position. "At least 30, armed with rifles." Sarah's unit snapped into defensive positions with practiced efficiency. Through her scope, she could see the approaching force, more of Reed's men, probably called in by Jenkins before his capture. But something about their formation troubled her. "They're not just reinforcements," she muttered, recognizing the tactical approach. "These are military, former cavalry." Chen appeared at her side, his own binoculars trained on the incoming threat. Confederate veterans by their riding style. Must be the mercenary company Reed was bragging about. The approaching force split into 3 groups with practiced precision, moving to surround the town. Their leader, a tall man with a distinctive cavalry saber, raised a white flag and rode forward. "Ghost Eye!" he called out, his voice carrying years of battlefield command. "I'm Colonel Harrison, formerly of the Confederate Army. I'm here to offer terms." Sarah kept him in her sights as she replied, "The only terms available are unconditional. Surrender, Colonel. Your employer Reed is dead, and we have evidence of his entire operation." "Reed was just a middleman," Harrison answered. "The people we work for, they're willing to be generous. Name your price. Everyone has one." The offer hung in the air like gunsmoke. Sarah could feel her people watching, waiting for her response. Even some of the townspeople, emerging from their shelters, seemed tempted by the possibility of a peaceful resolution. "You're right, Colonel," she called back. "Everyone does have a price." She adjusted her scope, centering it perfectly on his chest. "Mine is justice." The shot cracked across the morning air like thunder. Harrison's white flag spun away, the bullet having torn it from his grip with surgical precision. The message was clear. The next shot wouldn't miss. "That's your answer?" Harrison's voice carried genuine anger now. "You'd rather see this town burn than take a generous offer." Sarah's response was cool and measured. "No, Colonel. I'd rather see it defended by people who remember what honor means." The words struck home. She could see several of Harrison's men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. These weren't just mercenaries, they were veterans, men who remembered fighting for a cause, even if it was the wrong one. "Last chance," Harrison warned. "I have 3 times your numbers." Numbers. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Look around you, Colonel. Look carefully." As if on cue, movement rippled across the town's rooftops. Her unit had used the parley to perfectly position themselves, each one covering multiple angles. And they weren't alone. Townspeople who'd hidden from Reed's thugs now stood openly, rifles ready, defending their home. More importantly, the territorial marshal's posse was less than an hour away, a detail Harrison didn't know. Sarah just needed to hold out, to keep him focused on her until legal reinforcements arrived. "You're not fighting a widow with a rifle anymore," she continued. "You're not even fighting a Marine unit. You're facing an entire town that's learned to fight back. So yes, Colonel, those are my terms. Surrender now or learn exactly why they called me Ghost Eye." Harrison's response was a hand signal to his men. Rifles raised, sabers drew. Day-dawned sun caught on steel and gunmetal as both sides prepared for what could be their final clash. Sarah chambered around, the sound echoing in the tense silence. One way or another, Cedar Creek's fate would be decided in the next few minutes. She'd fought too hard, lost too much to back down now. The storm was about to break. The battle for Cedar Creek began with a single shot. One of Harrison's men, young and nervous, fired early. The bullet sparked off the church bell, and chaos erupted. Sarah's voice cut through the mayhem with parade ground authority. "Execute! Pattern Sierra!" Her unit responded instantly, falling into a defensive strategy they'd perfected in urban combat. Each shooter had preset zones, overlapping fields of fire, creating a deadly web of coverage. Harrison's cavalry charged in 3 waves, trying to overwhelm them with superior numbers. But Sarah had prepared for this, using the town's layout to funnel them into killing zones. The first wave hit hidden barricades, horses rearing in confusion. The second found themselves caught in devastating crossfire from the rooftops. "They're splitting up!" Jimmy called from his observation post, "trying to flank through the alleys." Sarah smiled grimly. That's exactly what she'd wanted. "Chen, spring the trap!" Hidden doors burst open as Sarah's veterans emerged from their concealed positions in the buildings, catching the flanking forces in reverse ambushes. The carefully coordinated defense was making Harrison's numerical advantage meaningless. His men couldn't use their mobility effectively in the confined town streets. "Ghost Eye!" Harrison's voice carried over the gunfire. "Call them off! We can still make a deal!" Sarah's response was 3 rapid shots that knocked him from his saddle. Not killing shots. She wanted him alive to testify, but precise hits that took him out of the fight. The loss of their leader shattered the mercenaries' cohesion. Some tried to retreat, others pressed the attack with desperate fury. Sarah moved through the chaos like a wraith, her every shot finding its mark. This wasn't the calculated patience of a sniper anymore. This was the fluid violence of a close combat specialist operating at peak efficiency. "Mrs. Mitchell!" Jimmy's urgent cry drew her attention. A group of mercenaries had broken through, heading for the church where the townspeople had taken shelter. Sarah was too far away to intervene directly, but she had prepared for this too. "Cooper, execute fallback Delta!" The church doors burst open, revealing not helpless civilians, but armed townspeople in prepared defensive positions. Hooper, his face still bruised but his hands steady, led the volley that dropped the attacking mercenaries in their tracks. Sarah used the distraction to move to higher ground, her custom rifle finding targets with lethal precision. Each shot was a message. This town was not helpless. These people were not victims, and Ghost Eye was not just a legend from the war. Harrison's remaining men began to surrender in groups, throwing down their weapons as they realized the trap they'd ridden into. The town had become a carefully constructed killing ground, every angle covered, every escape route blocked. Through her scope, Sarah caught movement at the edge of town, Jenkins trying to slip away in the chaos. She led him slightly, squeezing the trigger on his exhale. The bullet caught him in the leg, ending his flight. "Clear the streets," she ordered as the last shots faded. "Secure the prisoners. Chen, get me a casualty report." The battle's aftermath brought the sweet taste of victory tinged with the bitter reality of its cost. They'd won, but Cedar Creek would carry the scars. Buildings riddled with bullets, streets stained with blood, the innocence of frontier life forever changed. Sarah found Jimmy helping tend to the wounded, his young face serious as he assisted Cooper's wife with bandages. The boy had proven himself beyond any doubt, showing courage and loyalty that would have made any Marine proud. "Ghost Eye," Chen approached with his report. "Marshall's posse is 5 minutes out. Prisoners are secured. Harrison's alive. Doc says he'll make it to trial." She nodded, already thinking ahead to the next phase, ensuring justice was properly served, that the evidence reached the right hands, that the corrupt officials behind it all faced consequences. "Mrs. Mitchell," Jimmy called softly, making her turn. The townspeople had emerged from their shelters, gathering in the street. For a moment Sarah tensed, wondering if they would fear her now that they'd seen what she was truly capable of. Then old Cooper stepped forward, his face solemn. "Reckon we owe you more than we can ever repay." Sarah looked at these people, her neighbors, her friends, her new family. They'd stood with her, fought beside her, trusted her to lead them through hell itself. They didn't see a deadly ghost from the war. They saw their protector, their defender, their own avenging angel. "No," she said quietly, "you don't owe me anything. This is my home too, and some things are worth fighting for." The territorial marshal's arrival found Cedar Creek transformed. The quiet frontier town had become a battlefield. then a victory ground, and now stood as testament to what ordinary people could accomplish when pushed too far. Sarah met the marshal on Main Street, still in her combat gear but with her rifle slung. She recognized him. Jack Morton, a man known for his unwavering integrity. "Quite a situation you have here, Mrs. Mitchell," Morton said, surveying the scene. His eyes took in the captured mercenaries, the piles of seized weapons, and the determined faces of the townspeople standing guard. "More than a situation, Marshal," Sarah replied, handing him a thick packet of documents. Evidence of corruption reaching all the way to the territorial capital. Railway executives conspiring with arms dealers, using corporate expansion as cover for weapons trafficking. Morton leafed through the papers, his expression darkening. Reed's operation was just the beginning. There are more development projects planned across the territory, each one using the same playbook: forged documents, hired muscle, forced sales. The marshal nodded grimly. Got similar reports from other towns, but nobody could prove anything. Until now. He looked up at her. "Ghost Eye, I presume? That was another life. Maybe, but we could use someone with your skills. Territory's changing. Need good people to make sure it changes right." Sarah watched as her old unit helped the townspeople begin cleanup efforts. Chen was organizing work parties, while Cooper and his wife set up a proper medical station for the wounded. Jimmy darted between groups, carrying messages and supplies, every inch the capable young man he was becoming. "I have responsibilities here," she said. "Could deputize you. Make it official. Your town could be a base of operations." She considered it. The marshal was right. The frontier was changing. Railroad expansion wasn't inherently evil, but it needed to be done legally, ethically. Someone needed to stand watch to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "I'll need resources," she said finally. "Can't fight corruption with just a rifle." "You'll have them. President himself is concerned about corporate overreach in the territories. We'll get you whatever you need." A commotion drew their attention. Harrison, bandaged but conscious, was being led to a prison wagon. The former Confederate colonel caught Sarah's eye. "You know they'll just send others," he called out. "Men like us. We're a dime a dozen out here." Sarah walked over to him, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "You're right. They will send others. That's why I'm staying, to remind them that some lines shouldn't be crossed." She turned to address the gathered prisoners, pitching her voice so everyone could hear. "Spread the word when you get to prison. Cedar Creek is protected, and if anyone else thinks they can take what doesn't belong to them." She let the threat hang unfinished. Morton gave orders for the prisoners' transport, then turned back to Sarah. "Territorial Commission arrives tomorrow. They'll want statements from everyone. They'll get them, along with documented proof of every illegal action, every forged paper, every corrupt deal." The marshal smiled slightly. "You really did plan for everything. Had to. These are my people now. My home." As if to emphasize her words, Mrs. Henderson approached with a steaming cup of coffee. The same woman who'd been terrified of Reed's men now stood tall, a rifle slung over her shoulder as she helped guard the prisoners. Sarah accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, watching her town come back to life. The general store was gone, but that didn't matter now. She had a new mission, a new purpose that combined her military skills with her love for this community. "Ghost Eye's dead," she told Morton. "But Sarah Mitchell, territorial deputy and shopkeeper, she's just getting started." The marshal touched his hat in acknowledgement, understanding exactly what kind of ally he'd just gained. The frontier was changing indeed, but with people like Sarah standing guard, perhaps it would change for the better. In the weeks that followed, Cedar Creek underwent a transformation that went far deeper than just rebuilding damaged buildings. The town had found its strength, and more importantly, its identity. Sarah's new position as territorial deputy brought changes. The general store was rebuilt, but now it included a proper office where she could meet with people from other towns, seeking help against corporate overreach. Jimmy became her official assistant, his natural talent for gathering information making. him invaluable in their expanded mission. The townspeople who had stood with her during the battle maintained their readiness. Cooper organized a proper citizens' militia, while his wife turned her nursing experience from the battle into a permanent clinic. Even Mrs. Henderson started teaching other women how to shoot, declaring that Cedar Creek's daughters will never be helpless again. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the town viewed itself. They were no longer just another settlement waiting for the railroad to decide their fate. They had become a symbol of resistance against corruption, a beacon for other communities facing similar threats. One evening, Sarah found Jimmy sitting on the store's new porch, cleaning a rifle with the precise movements she'd taught him. "You." "No," he said without looking up. "People in town don't whisper about you anymore, about your past." Sarah smiled, understanding what he meant. The ghost of war had finally found peace, not by exorcising her past, but by using it to protect her future. The railroad eventually came to Cedar Creek, but on the town's terms. Sarah's evidence had sparked a territorial investigation that reshaped how corporate expansion was handled across the frontier. The new station was built where the community chose, with fair compensation for every affected property owner. Sarah kept her promise to Marshal Morton, turning Cedar Creek into a hub for law enforcement across the territory. Her old unit members would drop by periodically, some settling nearby, always ready to ride out when justice needed a ghost's touch. On quiet evenings, she could still be found at her post in the store's upper window, rifle close at hand. Not out of fear, but from the knowledge that peace required vigilance. The townspeople didn't mind. They understood that their safety rested in the hands of a widow who had become so much more. "Tell me again about Ghost Eye," young children would ask Jimmy, who had become something of a town storyteller. He would smile, look toward the store where Sarah stood watch, and begin, "There was once a woman who went to war and came home with a warrior's skills. But it wasn't until she found something worth protecting that she became truly dangerous." And in the growing dusk of the frontier evening, Sarah Mitchell, shopkeeper-protector legend, allowed herself a small smile, knowing she had finally found her true mission.